Welcome back. The City of Johannesburg Emergency Services confirmed that it extinguished a fire at another hijacked Marshall building yesterday in the morning. Now, the EMS says it responded to an inferno incident at Dalvos Street in downtown Johannesburg. It comes after a deadly Usindiso building fire in Marshalltown on the 31st of August, where 77 people lost their lives and many others were injured. Following yesterday's incident, Workers' Union GIWUSA held a public meeting with the working class activists and inner city residents. For more on this conversation, we are joined by President of General Industries Worker Union of South Africa, Mametlwe, Sebei. Mr. Sebei, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, the tragedy that happened last month in Marshalltown was followed, as I've said, by another building that caught fire on the same street. GIWUSA is of the impression that this is deliberate. How so?
Well, we do think that there is a deliberate policy of neglect, an abdication of responsibility by the City of Johannesburg to absolve itself of the responsibility to provide, decent accommodation for the working class and the poor of the city, absolve itself from the responsibility for rendering services that they are bound by law, including provision of electricity, including provision of water and other services. And what they have done is that they have abandoned this building. You would know that some of the buildings that are actually burning are owned by the city, but the city officials have left them to the criminal syndicates that are extorting money from the vulnerable and the disparate people that the city has an obligation in law to accommodate and to ensure they are provided a decent housing.
Now, as you mentioned that these buildings are owned by the city, how do you believe we mitigate the issue between the buildings being hijacked? And it seems as though it's now out of the city's hands in terms of how they're able to handle or tolerate the hijacking of these buildings. In what way do you believe we are able to circumvent the situation right now with the buildings no longer being in the hands of the city?
No, there's no such thing that the city has no control over the situation. You have city officials that are obviously colluding with some of these criminal syndicates that have done or have taken over. And, the politicians, as I've said, it suits them to abdicate responsibility because they want to be absolved from the obligations they have in law in terms of, fulfilling their obligation to provide and render services. Now, we think that the city must step in to reclaim this building, to expropriate those that are abandoned by private owners, to ensure that they are refurbished, they are developed, to provide a decent accommodation, including for people that are unable to afford an exorbitant, property in the suburban areas of Johannesburg, and people that can afford to travel from a distance, from, townships that are part of the geopolitical planning of apartheid that located many of the workers very far from, their workplaces. So we are saying that the city has this infrastructure that it can reclaim, it can develop. But more than that, we need a mega housing development project inside the city because this is a crisis of underdevelopment of housing, which has created a chronic shortage of housing, but also a massive problem of homelessness in the inner city. The question we need to confront is, how do we build Johannesburg that is hospitable, that is, habitable to, working class and poor people who are forced from, across the rural South Africa and even beyond in search of jobs, in search of services that are simply non-existent in areas where they come from. Of course, we can't say that everybody must come to Johannesburg. But to the extent that people are forced to come here, there's got to be a plan, but also we're saying that that plan has to be matched by the program to develop rural areas. And of course, the way that the economy is structured is part of the problem because it creates an uneven distribution of wealth as well as development that concentrate development in certain areas by underdeveloping the vast swathe of, areas across the country and across the entire sub-region.
Now, there was a meeting that was held today among working class movements. What was the outcome of that meeting?
Number of far-reaching resolutions in our view. One is that we are going to organize to oppose, the response so far, which comes from the city of Johannesburg, which is to bash the victims. You know, there were stories that were recounted of how the victims of that fire are being treated, including being subjected to harassment, to, you know, extortion, even by the police, who are taking advantage of the fact that some of them, including South Africans, by the way, have lost their documentation in that fire, and they are arresting them to extort them, you know, money for briberies. We are going to be opposing that. We also want to say that the evictions of the poor in the city must stop. The city must meet with us. We are going to write a letter to the city of Johannesburg to request a meeting on behalf of ourselves, but also a collective of other trade unions, community civic, inner city residents, as well as organizations that are supporting them, as well as organizations that have endorsed this campaign, to say we need a very just as well as democratic solution to the crisis that the poor are facing. Because we've got to create a city where the working class, where the poor can belong. People are forced to live in Limpopo, Eastern Cape and other rural areas out of the conditions that are forced by the realities in this country. And we cannot treat them in a very inhumane manner, in a manner that is humiliating, in a manner that is simply incompatible to all the commitments to human dignity. And we are saying, therefore, that we are going to be organizing a march as well, because we have no illusions that negotiations will be enough. We are planning a march. There's a date of the 1st of October, but that is subject to a further approval. We are also continuing to organize a relief efforts for the victims, but that march will also be saying we demand the city to compensate, we demand the city to support the victims as well as other people in the same situations. But also we are saying that, there are a number of things that the city could also be doing, because it's not just the people in the inner city. There is lots of informal settlements across the city, and what the people in those informal settlements are demanding is a rapid land release program, as well as mega housing development projects, to ensure that we also house people in the outskirts, in a township like Soweto, like Alexander, and other working class townships. But in conclusion, the very important discussion also was, we received delegation from, Western Cape, Reclaim the City, and other comrades. We also had interaction with Abahlali Basemjondolo in Durban, and the comrades are saying this is a situation in all the urban centers across the country, and we need to build a unified national campaign, which we are going to be considering around the issue of the housing crisis, as well as other delivery of services in the country, because we need a united working class on these issues.
Most certainly. Ultimately, what do you believe needs to happen to bring the Joburg CBD back to its glory days?
Look, you can't have Johannesburg without poor people in the way that the city does it. We need to address the problems of housing. The fact that the city is only building about 2,500 houses, in a city where the population increased by between 130 to 150,000 a year, in a city with a backlog of 500,000, houses that are in short supply in the city, which means that at the rate at which they are building houses, actually it will take 200 years just to resolve the current backlog. That problem has got to be addressed. And for that, you need a massive public housing program. More than that, I do think that the working class has got to put on the agenda the question of how do we remove this government. I do not think for a second we can continue with the ANC government, but also the response of all these bourgeois opposition parties that are blaming the migrants, that are blaming the poor, reveal the bankruptcy of these bourgeois parliamentarians and their parties. And what we need is an organized movement of the working class that can provide a political alternative to the crisis faced by the working class of housing, of unemployment, of poverty, of lack of services, both in the inner city of Johannesburg and other major urban centers, but also across the country as well, to ensure that there is a very sustainable development that can resolve the crisis of uneven and combined development of capitalism that has created this massive crisis of housing in urban centers as well as underdevelopment in rural areas.
As these movements that are in support of the working class, have you sat around the table with the City of Johannesburg, with the Department of Housing, to try and find a consensus with the existing problems that we currently are seeing within the CBD?
We have, as part of our resolutions, resolved to write a letter to demand a meeting with the City of Johannesburg. We are also engaged with support organizations, including Socio-Economic Rights Institute, Lawyers for Human Rights, and to say that how do they assist us as the movements of the working class, the organizations that have endorsed this campaign, as well as the inner city residents, to make submission to the commission that has been appointed by the Gauteng provincial government. We don't think that this is a commission that is going to address our problem. Nonetheless, we intend to engage it and to make robust submissions based on the lived experiences of the inner city residents about the way that they have been treated, the conditions in these buildings, but also the research and the work that has been done by many of the organizations that are part of our movement and which have grappled with these problems over time, as well as to formulate strategies and solutions that they've submitted. The only difference is that this time we intend to back it with a mass action, and we say, if and after we submit the memorandum to the City of Johannesburg, if they do not respond within 14 days, we have every intention to escalate, including a citywide shutdown, if that is what it will take to force them to the table, but also to find a meaningful, sustainable, progressive, pro-working class solution to the crisis, instead of the bashing of the poor, instead of the evictions, and all the kind of harassment that we have seen in the days that followed the tragedy.
All right, Mr. Sebei, thank you so much for your time and for giving us those inputs this evening. That's General Industries Workers Union of South Africa President, Mr. Mametlwe Sebei, speaking to us there on the outcomes of the meeting that they had with the inner city residents this morning, and some of the resolutions being that an organized march could possibly take place on the 1st of October.